I didn't like it.
What grade?
Well, hopefully you like my first grade. Louder.
Okay, so I have a short story for everyone, so if you can just take one and pass it around, start with that. And then I also have a worksheet for everyone, so take one and pass those around also.
All right, you ready? Yep. Okay. We're gonna work on visualization today. It's a comprehensive strategy. It's gonna help us remember what we read and form images in our head. Have you all
Should we
seen
put our names on both?
Yes. So when we read, we want to be able to form kind of a movie in our head about what we're reading, form characters and
Okay, so today we are going to be working on different comprehension strategies. So our first strategy that we're going to look at is asking questions. So before we even read this text that I have for you guys, we want to ask some questions about it before that. The one that we're going to start with is looking at the title and asking about the text and what we're wondering about. So if you look at the first question on your worksheet, it says, "Before I read this text, I wonder about."
It was followed by many, many more.
When you look at the title, it's called "The Goose Who Tried to Keep the Summer." So when I was wondering what this would be about, I wondered why a goose would want to keep summer. So that's what I put down as my first question. So if you would like to copy that question or come up with your own, write one down in that spot.
Descriptive words and adjectives that help form an image in my head. So before recess, that made an image that they were in school, in class, so that's kind of what I pictured. And then first flake and many, many more. I just pictured a ton of snow falling, the wind whipping it around in my head. And then it said they walked home, and by the time they walked home, it was already over the top of their boots. So I imagined it just snowing more and more and getting deeper and deeper. So I drew a school, and the little swirlies are the wind whipping the snow around, and the little stars are the flakes.
Alright, so the second question in the Ask Questions sections is, while I'm reading, I will try to figure out blank. So I'm going to be reading to this, and you guys can follow along, and if you have a question that you come up with while I'm reading, I want you guys to write that down, okay? And while we're reading, I might call on one of you, and if you have a question that you have, you can share that with everyone else, okay? So I'm going to start reading to you guys, and I just want you to listen and be thinking about questions that you might have. The Goose Who Tried to Keep the Summer. There was once an old wild goose who had led the flock of other wild geese every fall for years and years on their way south. He had a thick coat of white feathers. He wore orange-colored boots, and his bill was like a gold trumpet when he opened it to call. Honk, honk, honk. That was the signal for the others to rise from the meadows and marshes. He flew at their head, and the rest followed, one line on one side and one line on the other. He thought himself most important. Over the woods and the fields and the waters, everyone looked for the one wild goose in the fall. Honk, honk, honk. That was the wild goose telling them that it was time to get ready for the winter in the woods, and in the fields, and over the waters. He knew they waited for him, so he had grown to feel very proud of himself. He lived in a marsh that was sheltered on both sides by trees and was comfortable even if there was a frost now and then. A robin had once stayed in those trees all winter, and he sang proudly about it. "Why do I trouble to go south?" the old wild goose thought to himself. "The weather here will not grow cold if I stay. Honk, honk. I shall not trouble myself to migrate this fall, and then we shall see what will happen. Very likely, I shall keep the summer." So, by reading that, has anyone come up with a question that they might want to know more about from this story? Yes, Sarah.
How many geese are in a flock?
Very good. Anyone else have any questions? Okay, that's all right. Just keep thinking about things, and we'll keep reading on to see if Sarah's question gets answered. No one knew what the goose had decided, and they listened for him. The dandelion looked up from her home in the field and bobbed her little head as she waited to hear the call of the wild goose. Every fall she had sent a flock of winged seeds flying along with him as far as they could go. Then they would drop in other fields and begin making more dandelions for next year. She knew she must not wait too long. She listened, but she did not hear his honk, honk, honk. Puff, whir, off she sent her tiny winged seed without the call of the wild goose. The farmer buttoned his coat tightly and looked up among the gray clouds to see the goose. Every fall he listened to hear the call of the wild goose as he gathered his harvest. He knew, though, that he must not wait too long. He took his grain to the mill and filled the barn with red apples and orange pumpkins and yellow corn. He made warmer beds for the cows and horses and cut logs to burn in his fireplace. He was soon ready for winter without the help of the old wild goose. The brook called and called for the goose. Every fall she waited for him to fly over, and then she built her winter roof. She knew then that no other wild bird would need to drink from her waters. She must not wait long, though. There were her fish and the water spider and the beaver to shelter all winter, so the brook forgot at last about the wild goose and built a smooth ice roof to keep her children warm until spring. Honk, honk, cried all the other wild geese. It's time to migrate. Come with us. Honk, 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 cried the old wild goose from the sheltered marsh where he did not know what was going on. I am not flying south this year. I am staying north to keep the summer. Honk, honk, what a terrible time it will be, cried all the other geese. They talked among themselves, saying that no good could come of turning the seasons about, and of how he would probably be eaten in the end. Then they selected a wise young goose who had been Endman the year before, and they made him their leader. His boots were quite as orange and his bill golden as those of the old goose, and he would honk very well indeed. They went south with the new leader. All right, so now I want you guys all to stop and look at the third question in the Ask Questions section. It says, what is going to happen next? So from what I just read to you, I want you guys to come up with a question by yourselves on what you think is going to happen next. And if you need to look back into what I just read, that's fine.
You can do it?
Oh yeah.
Okay, people listen for those descriptive words. Everybody ready?
Yes.
When we went back inside, we were cold, wet, and tired. We made camp by the wood stove, and our feet tingled.
Once you have your question, I want you guys to share with a partner what you wrote. So look to your left or right and talk to someone else about your question.
I think that the goose is gonna freeze. This winter's gonna come anyway.
Is he gonna die?
Will the new goose be able to
goose
leave
will
the
probably
flock?
think it's way too cold.
I didn't know
And
mom
then who's going to freeze?
to go.
Yeah.
I said the goose will realize that he
I'm
can't
wondering
control
if the
winter.
goose is going to get
So the
cold
goose
in
was
the
going to
winter.
get eaten.
I don't know, but I did pretty good. The brook, I did good. Did good work.
All right, let's keep reading to find out and see if your predictions are correct. Soon winter came. He wore a crown of snowflakes. His cloak was embroidered with frost, and he carried a huge icicle as his scepter. Everyone was ready for him. The dandelion bowed her bare head as winter passed. The barn doors were closed, and the cattle stood safe and warm in their stalls. But the wild goose felt winter coming. An icy wind blew through his feathers. His throat was so stiff with cold that he could not blow his trumpet. His orange boots froze stiff as the marsh turned to ice. It must be the winter coming in spite of me, he thought to himself. It seems that I have not kept him away after all. I shall die, or he will freeze me. What shall I do? Then a sunbeam that was still strong enough to help a little heard the faint cries of the old wild goose and was sorry for him. She melted the ice so that the goose could pull out his feet, first one and then the other. She stood for a moment in winter's path as the goose rose and stretched his stiff wings and then started south. The chilly air was like a blast on his head. He was obliged to fly slowly, but he managed to call as he went. Honk, honk, here I am. I fly to tell you that winter is coming. He looked down at the woods and the fields and the waters. How strange! They had known it. They had not waited for the call of the wild goose.
So do you guys see how visualizing can help us?
All right, so we have one last question in our Ask Questions section, which is after I read, I ask myself. So I want everyone to think of that question by themselves, and then we're going to share out with everyone else.
Even if you're not coloring or drawing, you can still form that in your head. And if you need to, you could draw off your teacher reads as well.
Once you're ready with your question, just put your pencil down.
Write down 2 stars and a wish after her lesson. So like you need by which makes it sound so nice. Isn't that great? What can we get? What can enhance it? You have to I got distracted. But Netflix has like a fireplace that you can play and it'll like crack.
All right, Brooke, would you please share your after I read, I ask myself?
I said, why does the goose feel like everyone relies on him?
That's a good question. What does somebody think after reading this? Does anyone have any answers?
Because he thinks he's a leader.
Good. All right, does anyone else have a question that they have after they read?
I said, where did the author get the idea for this story?
Good. All right, that kind of takes us into our next section, which is making connections. So the first question in this section is, this reminds me of a time when. And what I thought of whenever I read this was, it reminded me when I see geese flying in their V shape, and it reminds me that that's what they do whenever they fly south for winter. So if you want to, you can use that example, or you can come up with your own.
I skipped pages. You guys really want to hear it or not? Karen, you're so eager.
So if you look at your next question, it's, I know about this topic because. So if you want to talk with a partner right now about why you might know something about this topic already, you can go ahead and do that. Or if you know about it in your head already, you can do it on your own.
I read books about birds migrating.
Are you serious?
I can see them when I look outside when it's about to be winter.
Me too.
I said it reminds me of the first snowfall because I live in Iowa.
My father's a birder, so he follows the birds.
All right, and our next question is, the setting of this story is just like blank. So on your own, I want you guys to think about what the setting of this story was and what it is like that you know about. And the last question, what's going on in this story is just like what's happening in blank. So if you have something that you can connect it to that you know about, go ahead and write that down. Would anyone like to share one of their last two answers?
I think it's like what's happening now or maybe a month ago because it started getting cold.
Yeah, that's a really good connection. So like what's happening in this story is a lot like what's happening in Iowa because it's starting to get cold here too. All right, if you flip your packet, our next section is visualizing. So the first question is, the author gives me a picture in my head, or in my mind, when he or she describes blank. So what I thought was a good description was when the author says he had a thick coat of white feathers, he wore orange-colored boots, and his bill was like a gold trumpet when he opened it to call. So this was a description of the wild goose, and it gave me a pretty good picture in my head because I could imagine what it looked like from how the author described it to me.
So today we are going to talk about comprehension and understanding many passages that we read, and we're going to summarize them to the best of our abilities. So can everybody tell me what a summary is?
So I just want you to think about the second question when it says, I can really see what the author talks about when he or she blanks. So if you want to look back in the passage and look for something that helps you visualize, I want you to look in there and just think about it. You don't have to write it down. But then in the third question, it says, I can draw a picture of what the author describes. So when you find what you want to think about, I want you to take that and draw a picture of what the author described for you.
A couple keywords or a couple key sentences about what you think this is about.
I don't know how to draw a bear tree.
There's something else going on with our food. thousands of years ago,
And it's okay if you're not a very good
this
artist.
changed with the growth of the cities and marketplaces. Even so, most people lived in the countryside, where they grew their own food. In 2008, the world's population reached a new milestone, and more than half of the world's population